Megan, thank you so much for being the juror for the Gilda Snowden Memorial Exhibition. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about the process of jurying this show.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for the opportunity to jury this show. Gilda was a beloved educator and mentor of so many people in this city, and I'm honored to be, the juror for this, for this show in her honor. And I mention that because, one, it's true, and secondly, because it indicates something about jurying the show, that I think we jury shows differently, at least I jury different shows, with different goals in mind. And given that this is the Gilda show, and given that it is about, and Gilda was about inclusiveness, about developing young talent, about having a broad view of what the Detroit art community is and could be, I wanted to jury this show from that perspective, from the perspective of increasing and giving and putting a spotlight on the changes that have taken place in this art community. 20 years ago, there was a Detroit aesthetic. Today, there are many Detroit aesthetics, and I think this show shows that. There were 525 images submitted for this show, which is frankly terrifying. And there were 188 artists submitted. I wound up jurying it down to 49 images, or 49 artists and 51 images. So you can see there was a huge amount of work that I could not include in this show, which frankly broke my heart, because the quality of the entries was extremely high. When you jury a show, as I said earlier, the notion for me for this show was wanting to show the diversity of the community, wanting to show the energy of the community. This show is jury completely blind, which means I'm jurying, looking at all those 525 odd images on a computer. All of the images are the same size, which means that a piece that I'm reading is 6 inches by 10 inches, looks to me the same as a piece that's 5 feet by 2 feet, which is pretty hard to keep reminding yourself when you're visual and when you're looking at images that are exactly the same size. I think most jurors will do a first cut on quality. And then beyond that, there's a question of what does it mean to be accepted, what does it mean to be, quotes, rejected or not accepted. Every juror is looking at work from the standpoint of not only its absolute quality, but one, how much space you have, two, what are the interests of the show, or what's the idea behind the show, three, what will go together. Because creating cacophony in a room and just jamming work in is a disservice to anyone who enters a show. And personally, I've been rejected from enough shows I could actually plaster my bathroom with all the rejections. And I've been in situations where the same piece has won a show and the following year actually been rejected from a similar type show. So you never know. And I think that the participation in the community, whether your piece is accepted or not, is really what allows you to grow as an artist. The pressure of getting into a show, the pressure of having to get a work done on a particular time, is something that for me causes me to be braver, causes me to decide that I have to make a decision about something, that I have to say it's this or that, close my eyes and go for it. And I think that in itself is a reward for having entered. And so I support and applaud anyone who entered this show. Well, this is Ian Machette's piece. And I thought it was a great way to start the show. It was used on the poster. And for those of you who know art history, it's quite a reference point to Duchamp's Nude Descending the Staircase. This, however, is We Rise, or at least that's what it felt like to me. With the sense of not going down, but rather going up, the play between the quite representational figure and the composition, which creates the energy in the piece. I gave it an honorable mention because I thought, as far as using the reference to art history, the excellent painting style that it is, and combining it with the issues that we're confronting today, that it was a brilliant and quite evocative imagery, and I was quite blown away by it. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through this. I'll try to be relatively quick in terms of comments, but I did want to comment on all of the pieces simply because it's a wonderful show. Let's start with K.A. Letts. This piece I thought was so interesting. It felt reminiscent to me of pieces that go to the Australian folk art tradition, but it's in motion. And usually when you get a piece that has that much feel of decoration, it feels very still. Instead, this has a dynamic to it. And look at the words down here. All of this down at the bottom, are words that are applying to the piece itself. It's both a monster, a prehistoric being, a myth, and it gives you a whole bunch to work with. Down here, Lynn Arbor's piece, I was just thrilled with the way that these lines work. I know this is a black and white gesso technique, but look at how the lines have such an energy played against the patterning of the tree trunk itself. Speaking of energy, this is Morris Stump, and it's called Leisure. And it feels leisurely. I mean, it feels just dynamic, it feels joyful. It's interesting about this show that so many of the pieces, absolutely, the titles contribute to the understanding of them. I mean, I'm an old abstract expressionist, so I was told if you had to put anything in writing, you didn't do it right. But in this case, and what's going on today in the art world, is that the verbiage, the titles and things, in many cases enhance the pieces. And in this show in particular, I'll try to point out a few of them, where the idea that's presented in the title is an absolute perfect reflection of what the piece is, or vice versa. Tara Spern's work, I gave a second place prize to. And I did something that I've really never done before, which was that I took two pieces as one image. Because in fact, the play between this and this is extremely profound in my opinion. Both are brilliantly done from a skill standpoint, but the feel that I got was the centaur, this position of holding the torch and of being straightforward and being, proudly, standing there, feels like the outside. It feels like what we would all like to do, frankly, and be. When you look at the small piece, though, what you see is the human heart that's being opened, repaired, or torn apart, you're not quite sure, by two pairs of hands, one black, one white. The zebra stripes then become an entirely different thing, not just pattern, but rather a metaphor for the racial issues that confront us. The heart shows the inside. So the two pieces together, to my mind, were much, much stronger and were quite moving because it gave me the sense of the interior and the exterior being presented as one. Who we wish to be seen as, who we are, or who we are and how we arrive at that. Donald Cronkite's piece is magic. In the sense that as one goes back further and further into the layers, one feels like you could be lost in this world, for a very, very long time. It gives you a sense of, because it's so tightly painted, and by tightly I mean so specific in terms of its black and white relationships, the hard and the soft, one wants to venture into it, one feels that one would be completely enclosed by it. The foreground is so right in front of you. Marco Sabraca's piece, is one of those small, totally intense images. This is a piece when I was saying about jurying, when something you're being told is small. When you looked at this piece on the computer and when I look at it in real life, it's the smallness of it actually amplifies the power of it. And it gives that sense of contained energy and contained thought. It felt like when I was looking at it on the computer that it must be at least 3 feet by 4 feet, something like that. So when it came in and was at this size, I thought, wow, the smallness of this actually made it feel very, very powerful. And this piece by Sean Renee Foreman, I thought was just totally engaging, because when you look at it, most of the time when people are shooting crowds, or shooting groups of children in particular, you wind up with these very straightforward, posed kind of imagery, or you wind up with something that feels completely, it doesn't have a story value. Yeah. Whereas this piece, you can't help but wonder what it is that she's looking at, and what's around that door, and what's and what's he thinking, and how could they manage to be working, their way through this doorway in the way that they are. This is Donetta Simpson's, photograph of Dennis Naraki. This is such an important place for this piece to be, given the history of Scarab Club and its long history of supporting portraiture in the city. Donetta Simpson belongs here. And this piece has a quiet power, and a certain amount of mystery to it in terms of the relationship between these very organic, pieces of pottery behind and Dennis's profound stare that comes through. The photograph next to it poses exactly a very different kind of feel, whereas Dennis's portrait is wide open. It feels like you're going right into his head. This piece, feels the opposite, that there's a wall between you and these children. This is Heather Gardner's piece. It's digital archival print, and again, the blurriness of it contributes to the distance that's created. And even further, the use of this up here, which is either paint or it's a denigration of the original gelatin print, or it gives that feeling of it, gives you a foreground that pushes these guys even further back. This is Hannah Sosin's piece. I awarded it an honorable mention for one very, very specific reason. From a technical standpoint, this is brilliant work. It's pencil. It feels on the level of photorealism in terms of the skill that's required. And usually, that's sufficient in terms of this type of work. In this case, though, there's a whole nother narrative going on. A narrative that's almost sci-fi. As you see, whatever this is, which feels like dragons built out of pieces of children's toys, or built out of the detritus of ancient civilization, coming through this, which started out looking like a garment, now it's looking like a tidal wave. Perhaps, on the other hand, it's something entirely different. But the more you look at this piece, the more you realize that the skill is in service of an even bigger idea and an even better idea, which is one that's completely captivating and completely creative. Brian Tillman gives you Detroit, gives you the sun of Detroit, gives you the energy of Detroit. Compositionally, this is a really interesting piece where the shadow, takes such prominence. One feels the energy of the Detroit neighborhood. And speaking of Detroit neighborhoods, Miles Gallagher's piece, gives you that energy from a completely opposite position, whereas Brian's piece gives you the whole street scene. This gives you the legs of a skateboarder, and yet you get that same energy coming across. I really liked this piece because it almost walks the line between abstraction, and representational work. I'd like to ask Trina to step back for a minute and look at the wall and look at these two pieces together, because it demonstrates something about this show that I wanted to make a point of, which is that it's hung beautifully. The connections, the juxtapositions of work on these walls add, a whole nother element to it. And in this case, the flesh of this, in an oil painting, and this, which is a sculpture covered in wax, both, though, have this sense of being hard and soft at the same time. The painting, because of its subject matter, the sculpture, because of the materials out of which it's made. Together, hung as they are, as the two points with the gate in between, it's just really brilliant exhibition hanging, and begins to add just a whole nother dimension to this work. This piece by Amelia Naraki, I thought is just an extremely brave piece. It's one, the painting itself is very good. Two, the subject matter is something that we never want to look at. And in fact, the title is Bumps, Bruises, and Burns, You Must Be Disgusted. And yet there's a human element to this piece. There's a softness to this piece. I'm not disgusted. I'm emotionally involved with it. And I think that's something that we ask of every painting. To go to the next piece, this is Mark Belchengo's piece. It's the third place winner. It's called Detained. And when you look at it, this is an example where the title is such a play with the actual image itself, because the piece does feel detained in this great, meat hook that's holding it. And yet the metal, and this is metal coated in a wax, it feels like it could fly away. It feels light. An interesting play coming out of pop art, where the material that is used to create a piece is actually the exact opposite of what one would expect. Coming around to, this is Anna Van Schaaf's, piece. It's called Bleat. Anna, I just had a one-man show here recently. This piece, though, shows a whole other side to Anna's painting, in my opinion, and one that I dearly love. What's interesting from a technical standpoint with this piece is, look at how loose, the painting is in this area. In fact, there's actually, I think it's probably oil stick, used down here. The strokes themselves feel absolutely perfect. They, looked at it from here down, it's completely non-objective, and yet the strokes themselves are part of the whole subject matter. Without that energy, this would not be nearly the strongest piece as it is. Christine Ritchie gives us a wonderful example coming out of abstract expressionism. Is it figurative? Is it reflections in the water? Is it paint only? There's enough structure in this that it gives one room to create one's own definition of what the subject is. And the thickness of it in through here is really intriguing. Isaiah Ford's piece feels very, very contemporary. A play with cartooning, a play with graffiti arts, in a certain sense. And yet it also works just completely non-objectively. You can see the imagery in it, you can see the face here, you can see the face here. The more you look at it, the more it becomes, totally image-driven. And yet the overall feel of it is one of just motion. It's a whirlpool that feels like one is being pulled into it. And Alan Paulson's portrait here also has some really interesting surprises in it. That kind of a pose is almost always a pose that's open, that says the model is open to the world, is looking out, and yet the feeling of this painting is that everything is withheld. You know, and it's done by the fact that the gaze, you know, refuses to meet the viewer. No matter how long you look at this piece, you know, you still have no idea how do you get inside, you know, of the mind of the sitter. And that tension between the pose and between the expression on it, you know, creates an energy in this piece that's very, very powerful. Doug Cannell's piece looks like a piece of jewelry. The finish on it is exquisite, and the play between the copper and the wood, you know, the colors are wonderful. And this is what's really cool. If you can take a fast look at these small little indentations here. The holes make it feel as if you were looking at water, that you were looking at spray. And they're the things that set this apart and make it very engaging. Anna Kosharovsky's pieces, she submitted 4 of these, and had I had the room, I would have put all 4 in, because they continued to change, dealing with the same subject matter and the same colors. I don't know whether you can notice it or not, but there's gold in here that creates a glitter, and it changes the depth on these pieces. The interesting thing about these weavings, to me, is that you have a sense of distance and a sense of foreground. And the foreground is created by these sort of building shapes, you know, that come in over top of the more non-objective weaving. They're a very interesting development in this series. Rochelle Thomas's piece, I thought, was a brilliant play on Betty Sayre's work. Betty Sayre, of course, the wonderful African-American artist who used the image of Aunt Jemima. And here you have that image of Aunt Jemima being evoked again, but I never saw anyone use the waffles. And using the background of the waffles, and then this whole sense of the Aunt Jemima reference, I thought was just very, very funny, very original, and an excellent piece. And Kip Kowalski's piece, you know, the forms, the more you look at them, the more engaging they are, the way they morph into hands and feet and size, and something seems big and something seems small. There's a real understanding both of the organic nature, you know, of how bodies work, and also of surrealism, with quite a lovely nod to Francis Bacon. This piece is intriguing, by Kelly Agius. I hope I haven't totally destroyed the name, because it feels as if the body is encased, you know, in pillowcase that's being torn apart. What that image means, I don't know, but I find it very painful, and at the same time very engaging. It has that sense of surrealism and that sense of giving you an image that's absolutely perfectly drawn and completely mysterious. And Pamela Day's sculpture is another one of these pieces that seems much, much larger, both in the image that was on the digital application I was using, and also in my mind's eye. It's a small piece that has just such humor to it, wisdom to it. Again, I think a very, very engaging and unusual piece. As is Brenda Bean Shackelford's, you know, just an exquisite image of vintage book cover, slightly mysterious. You know, one wants to make the connections between all these various small pieces that are found here and just continue to look at it. Deborah Kashdan, you know, has managed to talk politics in a completely non-objective form, and somehow or other it works. It has the power, you know, and the energy of political commitment. Whereas Gail Borowski's piece is quite mysterious. This is a bit of lace, you know, wrapped around a ceramic bone. It feels as if it encompasses the notion of life and death, hard and soft, beautiful and prehistoric. Just a very, very mysterious piece. And Julie Lambert's piece is also quite mysterious. The title of that was The Cat, I Was Warned. I can't find the head on this cat. I've looked at this piece 2 or 3 times. Perhaps that's intentional. The marshmallows in it. I have no idea how this whole thing works from a selected image standpoint, but I can sure tell you from a visual standpoint, I find it completely intriguing and look at it over and over again. From some quite complex images to one that's just extremely simple and powerful. Jerome Patajac's piece, and I'm sure I butchered your name, I apologize.
Patajak.
Patajak. When I look at this piece, I feel the humanity in it and the power in it. And the flaws, or what might say, gee, all this thing should be painted black, it should be straightened out. The handmade paper aspect of it and the way you have these small images of color keep one looking at it, keep you engaged. I find it very powerful and a very spiritual, kind of piece. And Lila Kajala's piece, speaking of spiritual and mysterious, I think certainly contains both of those qualities. I gave this piece an honorable mention. She actually submitted 4 pieces, of which this was the most abstract. And to me, therefore, the strongest of the 4. I particularly was taken by the worm tracks in the wood itself up at the top. Whether those are natural or handmade, I do not know. But either way, they almost represent a tie to the earth, a tie to the coffin, so to speak, also a tie to calligraphy. The image itself, at first glance, seems to be just completely detached, and yet when you look at the eyes under the hijab, they are engaging. She presents something precious. What that is, I'm not sure, but the preciousness of it, I understand. Valerie Mann's piece, when it came into the show, unfortunately I was not available to be able to see it, to be able to jury it before it was, after it was hung. And so when I saw this on the digital jury thing, I was just completely engaged, because it's just an absolutely intelligent, funny, engaging play of taking cursive writing and expressing it in electrical cords and rope and everyday found objects to create something that's extremely beautiful. And the more you look at it, the more it opens up a sense of writing and a sense of communication. The shadows in it, how you would light this piece would really make a difference to it. If you look at how it's lighted today, at the bottom, look at the layers that come out from the shadow that make this piece come forward, in a very powerful manner. We've been talking a lot about, on this whole wall here, about notions of mystery and about notions of contrast. Jeff Cancelesi's piece, I think, falls into that category as well. I mean, here you have gold, which is supposed to be such a precious element, something that makes us all happy, something that sparkles, and you can see there's even glitter in this piece. And yet the face itself is anything but happy. It's very much internal, it's very looking inward, it's very much decomposing or beginning to fall apart, or has the capacity of doing so. The contrast between the material that's being used, the comment on perhaps, our contemporary society and our focus on material objects and gold, versus, who we are as people. I think it creates a metaphor that's very, very interesting. The title of it is Fool's Gold. And these two pieces, I was talking about display in an exhibition, and how the exhibition display can actually even increase or add yet another element to it. Barbara Dorshan's piece on the right uses lines basically to prevent us from entering into a very mysterious place. The top lines, being heavy, being, so opaque, work almost as a fence. We're tempted to move backwards, through the use of this green gray that wants to come forward, but we're prevented from doing so. In Amy Parker's piece, the opposite is presented. Here you have, a wide open path, that's inviting us to go forward, but what we're going forward to is quite unsure, is quite unclear. This is called ancestors seeking advice from the elders, and you get that sense of mystery in it. Notice, what struck me also was how the colors of the flowers get represented in the pattern on her dress. It ties her together both to this world, but the color of her skin and the color and the way that she's moving towards this ties her to another world as well. David Clement's piece, is just a wonderful play on words, a wonderful play on imagery, a wonderful play on position, on pose. Honor bright boys' blouses, shirts, and play suits for real boys. Against, a figure who's very much almost in the same pose, moving forward, whatever, what's real, what's not, what's today, what's the past, what do we really, what means the word honor, what means the word, what means honor bright. All of those are posed in this seemingly spontaneous photograph. Michael Kelly Williams' piece also poses a whole bunch of ways of interpreting things. This piece is called Family Tree, and at first glance, knowing that, one can read it as, as a tree, as a close-up of an evergreen or whatever. On closer inspection, though, the figures jump out at you. Figure here, figure here, figure here, figure here, all of whom have halos, all of whom are joined together in an organic whole, and yet, have a personality of their own. The piece almost seems to dance. It's just a wonderfully evocative metaphor of family connections, through the ages, of ancestors, of who we are as people. Something that's extremely important in a period like we're in today.
Megan, I wanted to mention that we have here a space that is empty that had Kristen Canda's painting in it, and I don't know if you remember the work. We'll have a link where people can actually look closer at all the works that you're talking about today. But do you remember it had the kind of
oh yes,
flowers in the background and the stars that went through that?
It was a close-up still life piece with wonderful darks and lights in it, and stars that came down. I'll take a look at it again on the website.
Okay, great.
Loretta Marco's piece is also has some surprises in it. First of all, look at the composition on this. I'd never seen a figure where the foot wound up on the edge of the canvas. It's just an intriguing composition, and it's called The Gardener, what is it? The Gardener and Apprentice. And you'll notice that the apprentice is doing all the work. The gardener, on the other hand, seems to be lost in his own contemplation. The apprentice seems to be a little creepy, with the hand, doing this, sort of almost a skeletal type hand. The composition of it and the patterning of it and things just add a whole. There's a lot to think about in this piece. And Lori Zervalik's piece, is called Bach Serenade Flute, and it does have that feel, of music, of something rising spontaneously. From a formal standpoint, a little bit of red in here, just really gives it a focal point and gives you that sense of a rise. Trina Sonderberg's piece is one of two that she submitted. The other piece was much more of a daytime, feel to it. But this piece has a magic to it of the night. One sees the dragonflies, but look at this in here, this lovely line work, which is in the foreground because of its sharpness, and yet the smallest thing really in the entire piece. Charles Alexander's piece becomes more and more complex and more intriguing the more one looks at it. At first glance, one could read it as a portrait in a frame. The more you look at it, though, that portrait becomes a million different heads, surrounded by some type of a mechanical, almost a clockworks kind of feel to it. It's a very engaging piece. Lisa Goddard's piece I gave a honorable mention to. And this is really a painter's painting. Many of you who know art history have had experience with Morandi, who was an Italian painter during the Second World War and around that period, who worked with very, very simple objects to create all kinds of different emotional states and commentaries on the world. This works in a similar fashion, with very, very simple shapes that do very strange things the more you look at them. Here you have what seems to be a table. And yet, the items, the two blocks here, aren't really sitting on it. I mean, because the perspective is strange. The painting in this is beautiful. It's one stroke and it's the right stroke. Same thing here. It's a different texture, but it has an intensity because of the texture. When you look at it, what is this and where does it exist in space? What's the relationship here and here and here? It feels almost like this is falling, and yet it's suspended. This here says that it's falling, and yet it never reaches the bottom of this. These two lines make this seem in motion, and look closer at it, there's 4 or 5 different layers of blue. So I gave it the honorable mention because I think in its control and in its willingness to present imagery that can be read in two or three different ways, that it's a very, very engaging piece and a very technically skilled piece. And Rita Patel gives one, and pays honor to the Detroit, community of Cass Corridor. The play of this, the way the space is cut into various layers, creating almost an alphabetical or almost something that one wants to read. It almost feels like letter forms, layered one on top of the other. Now let's look at the sculpture.
Okay, all right.
The sculpture, let's start with this one here. Because the thing that was so really nice about this show was I was thrilled with the amount of sculpture that came in. It's not often in a show like this that one has as many three-dimensional offerings as there are. Plus the fact that it gave me a chance to get more pieces in because because I didn't have to deal with wall space. This piece I found just completely charming. It's found objects, you know, there's a joy about it, there's a confidence about it. The antlers turning into snakes and back again, you know, gives one the sense of myth. I don't know what the myth is, but it's one that I'd like to find out about or maybe write for myself. And this also has a humor about it, and a very, very creative play. You have the three-dimensional person looking at it, you know, the three-dimensional shape, you know, and then the cartoon balloon into which you can write whatever you want, or perhaps nothing at all. Visually and technically, it's quite a tour de force to be able to put that kind of a flat image together with the three-dimensional image and have both of them hold their own within the space. And let's look at this by Chris Snyder. Oh, and this was Angela Larson's piece. This is Chris Snyder's piece. When I first looked at it, you know, I felt like, oh, look at that. The branch is trying to escape, you know, and it's being like held so tightly against this very symmetrical three-dimensional object. And then I looked at the title of it, which is The Chaser, and I thought, it gets across exactly, you know, what I felt when I looked at it, that the image is bound. It's again a very Detroit, you know, kind of sculpture, kind of aesthetic, and a very eloquent one. Now, we've been through this whole show, and you're probably wondering what won first prize. And so this is the first prize. It's by Ann Smith. It's entitled Friday Barely Arrived. And again, I bring the title up because this is an exhausted something or other. I mean, you look at it, excuse me for walking in front, but you look at it from here, and it has the sense of a figure, you know, that's just completely deflated, you know, walking forward. But the thing that really got me was if you look, Trina, take a picture right here. Because underneath this piece, you have these pods, you know, the legs that are holding it up, you know, seem to be just about on their last legs. And then you look and you see all of these seeds and all of this softness that's a total surprise. It gives it a sense of hope, you know, for want of a better term, or of something that's going to change. And in that sense, I thought that the use of the materials, the fact that it's a beautiful image to start with, the color, you know, is something that's very, very alluring. And yet it has both that sense of development, you know, and destruction, you know, encompassed within, you know, what at first glance appears to be a falling apart school. Her other piece back here, I just wanted to show in reference, also has that kind of magic to it, in terms of, you know, of a shape that starts out as something organic, becomes a person, you know, goes back into something that may just be almost a non-objective. It walks a very, very fine line between narration, you know, and non-objective work. So that's the show. Again, I hope you've enjoyed it. I apologize for all of the stuttering and missteps that I've done in terms of walking through this. But I wanted to say something that I think is important. In this period, art really shows what it's about. Because what we see from art and from this kind of a show is the creativity and the curiosity that are common to us all, you know, and it reminds us that that's some of the things that make us human. And the attempt by one person using that creativity and that curiosity and that skill to communicate, you know, what they're feeling, you know, what they're thinking, you know, what they saw yesterday to another, is the thing that binds us together as a community. And so in this pandemic, when we're isolated, when we're afraid, when we're lonely, when we're bored, art has the way of presenting us a window, a door, both into the window into someone's mind and a door to walk through, into this sense of community. And so I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to present this show to you all.